Well, thank you, Mr. Schumann. Very kind of you. You gentlemen do a really fantastic job here, the whole crew. Okay, Mercer County and the Civil War. We're going to be talking about the war and the aftermath here. And there'll be a good deal of this about the aftermath. I'm going to be going through certain lists of names, talking about different units. And one thing you should understand is these lists are not complete. We only have partial information on them. So I'll give you some examples of local people who served in units, but there are people I will definitely miss that aren't going to be on it because I don't have that information. But Mercer County in the Civil War again, and this one has a little bit of, has quite a bit actually about Dublin Township. April 12th, 1861, Civil War begins. And with the beginning of the war, people need an army. Well, at the beginning of the war, there are only 16,000 men in the United States Army. And with the beginning of the war, a large part of that is going to head south, including many of the best officers. They're gone. And so then you have both these competing forces, both trying to raise armies. The Union begins. Lincoln asked for 75,000 men to begin the war effort. They're to be enlisted for 3 months because everybody at the time thinks this is going to be a short war. Now, when we talk about the basic unit in the Civil War is a company, 100 men at full strength, which they are almost never at. But 100 men in a company, most of these units are raised locally in different counties and towns and cities. And so you're usually serving with people you know, and you know, friends, relatives. 100 men to a company at full strength, 10 companies make a regiment. Regiments make brigades, brigades make divisions, divisions make corps, corps make up armies. So you have these different gradations. The very first company raised in Mercer County was Company K of the 17th, OVI. You're going to hear that term a lot, OVI, Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment, OVI. Company K and the 17th, they begin service in May of 1861, and they're sent down to the western section of Virginia. Virginia had seceded from the Union, but the people in the western part of the state a lot of them didn't want to go. They were not sympathetic. There were not a lot of slaveholders in the western part of Virginia, and a lot of them did not want to leave the United States. And so the Union rushes troops in, especially units from Ohio and Indiana. And they go down there and they campaign. And there are a lot of things that at the time, like called the Battle of Philippi, for example, a lot of what they call battles that later on wouldn't have counted much as skirmishes. I mean, where the casualties are in dozens rather than in thousands. But campaigning down there, you can see what the 17th did. They chase guerrillas. They're involved in a couple of these minor battles. They don't have any battle deaths, though. None of them. But what they do down there is successful because Western Virginia stays in the Union and becomes the state of West Virginia. These guys are done with their service, though, by August of 1861. Their 3 months are up. They head on home. Most of them re-enlist, but not all of them. And this company ceases to exist at that time. The first 3-year company, because that's what they switched to. They knew longer war, it's going to take longer. We need 3 years service. The first of these is Company K, the 40th OVI. Company K of the 40th OVI, they are at the Battle of Chickamauga, Siege of Chattanooga, Atlanta Campaign, Battle of Franklin. Those are all in what's called the Western Theater of the Civil War. The part of the war between the Appalachian Mountains, and the Mississippi River. And most of the units raised here, that's where they're going to serve. Over the course of the war, this unit, Company K, lost 4 men killed in action, 3 guys died later of their wounds, 9 died from other causes. And what we were going to see when we look at any of these units is more people die from disease than die from bullets. Now, the 71st is the regiment. There are 3 companies raised in Mercer County. One of these is raised locally. And I'm going to come back to these guys a little while later. We're going to go into a little more detail about the 71st. But the 99th Regiment, Company F, raised in Mercer County. Again, those battles are all on the Western Front. But you have these Dublin Township men, quite a few of them in Company F. Lieutenant Dave Robinson, Sergeants Henry King, Jacob Knight, Corporal Claiborne Walk, James Cavender, Jacob Carnes, William Figley, John Seekower, who dies over the course of the war, Monmouth Leroux, whatever, George Benz, Jacob Hinkle, who dies over the course of the war. And some of those names, you know, you will recognize still to this day as local names. The 118th is another one of these units raised locally. Adam Rush from Dublin Township is part of Company C of the 118th. And again, Battle of Atlanta, Battle of Franklin, Siege of Nashville, those are all on the Western Front. We come down to one we mentioned here a minute ago, the 156th. Company I, was he in Company I? Company I of the 156th. This is a special kind of unit because all these other ones are raised for 3 years. These guys, there's an emergency in 1864. Washington, D.C. is threatened. Jubal Early's army is threatening to take Washington, D.C. And they need troops quickly. And they call them up. And these guys are only enlisted for 100 days, not 3 years. And they are rushed down to Maryland. That's what this unit ends up down in Maryland protecting railroad lines. And again, we look at some of these. Whoa, look at this name here. Evan Crane, Joseph, was that Joseph Palmer? Joseph Palmer, Jacob Guy, Jay McCagg, again, from Dublin Township. But mentioned this earlier, there's no requirement that you enlist in your county. You can go to some other county, and a lot of people from here enlist in other counties. A lot of them end up in this particular regiment, in the 34th OVI. This is raised around Clermont County. Most of the units in this regiment are raised around Clermont County, and I don't know why so many people from Dublin Township ended up there, but, you know, and again, a lot of these names you still see locally. But they're campaigning down in Western Virginia, and then they're in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And again, they had a lot of combat. The regiment had 120 men killed in combat, 10 officers and 120 men killed in combat total. But Samuel Hedges, Michael Kelly, Levi Gay, Frederick Smiley, Lafayette Eichler, George Dysart. Again, some names, or at least some of those names, you're going to recognize as local names out of this area. But yeah, I wish somebody would tell me why all these guys went down to Clermont County. I don't know. But now, another unit that has even a lot more of these guys in it, 46th OVI. 46th OVI. I'm going to talk later here about the 71st. Well, the 46th is the regiment that has the most people from Van Wert County in it. There are over 230 guys from Van Wert County in this regiment. But a lot of guys from Mercer County crossed over to enlist in it, in these units, especially from Dublin and Union Townships. But again, 10 officers, 124 men killed in combat. These guys go through the whole thing. They're at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, Atlanta, siege of, New Hope Church, March to the Sea, North Carolina campaign. They're even in the Grand Review after the war where the Army parades in victory. But again, you see a lot of these names down here below. Dublin Township guys. Adam Truby, Thomas McLaughlin, Evan Crane, James Tullis, William Pontius, Amaka King, Thomas Coates, Emmanuel Bowen, John Mim, William King, Isaac Dilbone, David Moorhead, Emmanuel Jackson. Again, a lot of Mercer County names there. And I need to repeat this. These lists are not complete. There are guys from this county that were in here that I just don't have their name because I work from a certain list. Yeah. But again, okay. An individual example of one of these guys who served. I don't know, have you guys ever read this book in any of Mr. Minnick's courses? He uses this. But this is a guy named Aaron Sutton. Now, there's a name you hear a lot around here, Sutton. Aaron Sutton. And Aaron Sutton was a local guy from right outside of what was back then Shanesville. But when he enlists in the 80th Company A of the 83rd OVI. And that company was raised around Cincinnati. The whole regiment was raised around Cincinnati. What I found out later about him was that he was originally from Cincinnati, and that's why he had that tie down there. He goes down there, he enlists, becomes a corporal, marches off to war. He's at the siege of Vicksburg, the successful siege of Vicksburg, and he's in something called the Red River Campaign down in Louisiana. And there, he's captured at the Battle of Mansfield. And he's going to spend the rest of the war, or most of the rest of the war, in prison camps in Texas. First at a place called Camp Ford, and another place actually called Camp Gross. And the fact that about a third of the guys that were there died gives you an idea what kind of place it was. But while he's there in these camps, he makes 2 escapes, extended escapes. He's gone for several days, but in each case, he's recaptured. After the war, he returns here, marries Harriet Balzell. They have 7 kids. But he has a journal, and that's going to serve as the basis for this particular book. And I recommend this book if you can get a hold of a copy. It's a good read. Guy's got a sense of humor about his experiences. Doesn't have the kind of flowery language popular at the time. Now, I want to come back to the 71st. You can see the battle flag of the 71st there, battles they were in. And this is a book about the 71st by a guy by the name of Martin Stewart. Again, a good read I can recommend. But notice the title, Redemption. If you need redemption, you're considered to have done something wrong. And the 71st has a lot of controversy involved with it. Now, these men are some of the leaders of the 71st. The man in the middle is James Carlin. He had been a sergeant in that 3-month regiment. He'd been a sergeant in the 17th. His 3 months enlistment had ended, and now he's organizing his own company. and he will prove to be an outstanding commander. A guy I don't have a picture of there, a guy named Gideon LeBond. This guy organizes Company A. Gideon LeBond organizes, and he's from Jefferson Township. He's a farmer down there. And he organizes Company H. And again, becomes its captain. Captain Smith Clark. Smith Clark had been a farmer. He had been a surveyor. He had been a school teacher and then a school official. He isn't this age when he organizes. He's in his late 30s when he organizes this regiment. But he organizes it out of here, out of Shanesville. And it's overwhelmingly got men from Dublin Township and Union Township. The problem for this regiment isn't the captains leading these companies. The problem for this regiment is that guy, Colonel Rodney Mason. Colonel Rodney Mason was a lawyer from Springfield, Ohio. And Rodney Mason has an inn. Rodney Mason's father is a congressman. And that's going to cover Rodney pretty good. Rodney Mason is at the Battle of Manassas at the beginning of the war. Bull Run. And at the Battle of Bull Run, Rodney ran. He didn't stand and fight, he took off in a battle that was a Union defeat. But even though he had bad performance that day, he was given command of a regiment. And it's got to be because of his dad. Well, here we go. These are some of the men in the 71st. Now, some of those pictures were taken later in life, obviously. The average age for a Civil War soldier is about 25. Some of these guys are way past 25. But the two gentlemen in the middle were part of Company D, and both these men will die during the war. Benjamin Nickel and George Collins will both die during the war. But in April 1862, the 71st is part of Grant's Army of the Tennessee. And they are down in the state of Tennessee and actually have just crossed the Tennessee River. Kind of redundant there. This army is largely inexperienced. Most of these men have seen no combat. And as they get across the river, they are attacked. A massive Confederate attack hits them. And when it hits them, a lot of these men skedaddle, as this gentleman is doing right here in the middle. They take off. They run. Thousands of them run, including men in the 71st run. And I think Rodney Mason ran faster than just about anybody else. But what happens, there is a giant retreat. The Northern Army looks like they're about to be pretty much disintegrated. But there's a massive artillery bombardment that slows down the Confederates. And then a reinforcement Union Army shows up, the Army of the Ohio, under Don Carlos Buell. They show up, the Northern line holds. And then the next day, the North goes on the attack. And actually, when the battle is all done, it's a really bloody Northern victory. It's actually the bloodiest battle of the war up until that time. After the battle, the 71st and two other regiments are condemned for not standing and fighting. It is not fair. They're condemned in the newspapers. It's not really fair to them because large part of the Northern Army took off that day. And many men in the 71st stood and fought. 10 men from the 71st were killed that day, 20 were wounded. But they are, so Again, did some of them run? Yes, some of them ran. Did they all run? No. And did they have a lot of company when they were running? Yes. But the 71st, after that, were reassigned to Fort Donelson. This was a fort the North had captured earlier in the war. And part of the force stays at Fort Donelson, and half part of the force including companies A and H, Mercer County companies. Company D is part of another part of this unit that's sent to Clarksville, which was nearby Fort Donelson, but which was a railroad hub. And Rodney Mason goes with the guys going to Clarksville. Okay. A Confederate army shows up. I'm overstating it. A Confederate force shows up under a guy with a colonel named Alfred Rankin Stovepipe Johnson. So I think is a great name. He got the nickname because earlier in the war he'd bluffed a bunch of Union soldiers into surrendering with these phony guns made out of stovepipe, and so they call him Stovepipe Johnson after that. But he tells Mason, "You're surrounded. I have 800 men to your 300. You need to surrender." And Mason, being unable to make a decision, calls all his officers together and says, "What should I do? What should we do? Let's vote." And they vote 11-3 to surrender. After they surrender, they find out the Confederates only have 300 men too. They've been bluffed into surrendering. Now, Johnson takes his army, or again, I'm overstating it. He takes his force and they attack the troops at Fort Donelson. At Fort Donelson, they're driven off. The attack fails there. Of course, the one big difference between Clarksville and Donelson is Mason isn't at Donelson. These guys that were captured are later all going to be exchanged. At that part of the war, they were doing exchanges. So within a few months, they're going to be back with the rest of the regiment. But subsequently to this, right? Okay, there was a reaction. Comments about Colonel Rodney Mason, a constitutional coward, according to Ulysses S. Grant. According to the Western Standard, which is the Salina Daily Standard today, the cowardly colonel of the 71st. According to an order signed by President Abraham Lincoln, Colonel Rodney Mason of the 71st Volunteers is, by order of the President of the United States, cashiered for repeated acts of cowardice in the face of the enemy. He's kicked out of the service for being a coward. And those 11 officers that voted that way are all kicked out too. The ones that voted to surrender. They're all gone. And that includes Smith Clark. Now, what we find out, though, about the 71st is, they're going to continue through the war, but who your commander is makes a difference. This is the new commander. At the Battle of Nashville in 1864, November 15th, 1864, the Union force there, the Union army there, is under siege. They are going to break out of that siege. The 71st is part of the attack to break out. They overrun 2 Confederate positions. They capture a load of Confederate weaponry, including cannons. They take many Confederate prisoners. It makes a big difference who your leader is. And not having Rodney in this situation made a difference. Oh. Now, we're going to head back to the home front now. And politics is happening back here then, as usual. There are elections. There are extremely partisan feelings. Worse than now, even though the most intense people have already left for the Confederacy, there is a lot of friction still in among the troops back here in the north, or the politicians and the voters back here. When you look at this chart, if you can see it, you can see this breakdown of groups within the political parties. Radical Republicans were people who believed that Lincoln should free the slaves. They're critical of Lincoln for not freeing the slaves sooner. They want a harsh war with the South. They want the plantations seized. They want blacks to get the right to vote. They want, a more extreme war. Conservative Republicans want emancipation, but they think it's more important to save the Union than to have emancipation. But they support the war effort. Lincoln is somewhere between these two groups. War Democrats, these are Democrats that support, they're actually, a lot of them are against emancipation, but they support the war effort. They believe the war is worth fighting. Yeah. So they support it with money and volunteering. Those three groups are the Unionists. Peace Democrats are Democrats that believe that there should be a negotiated settlement at the end of the war. Got to stop this fighting. Thousands of men are dying. Let's stop the fighting. And if we go to the extreme with Clement Vallandigham there, they believe, Copperheads believe that they're sympathetic to the South. Who were Copperheads? People who had family ties or financial ties to the South. Also, many new immigrants, especially what we call economic immigrants, people who came over not because of religious, persecution or whatever, but because for economic opportunity. A lot of these were sympathetic to the Copperheads. When we look at this term Copperhead, it comes from this badge these guys used to wear. Democrats used to wear this badge. That's a Liberty Head penny. And they would wear that badge with the Liberty Head on it. That badge was made out of copper. And from that, of course, they got Copperhead, which they tied to the snake, these enemies of America, enemies of the Union. Now that badge could really, at times, produce extreme reaction. And we get an example of that in a community near this area. You might have heard of this community. It's called Wilshire, Ohio. But in 1863, there's an incident that happens there, and it begins with a Democratic parade through town. And there are a bunch of pro-unionists and soldiers on furlough watching this parade. And what happens next is a matter of controversy, because the pro-union guys say what set things off is that somebody ripped the bandage off one of these soldiers. The Democrats say one of these pro-union guys, went into the march and ripped one of those badges off one of these guys, and that set them off. But for one reason or the other, it started, and first fists are flying, and then clubs are being swung, and then bricks are thrown, and finally shots are fired. And when it's all done, 20 people are injured, many of them very seriously. So if you can imagine that, a giant riot in Wilshire, Ohio, you've got more imagination than me. But back then, too, back then there were only 140 people in Wilshire, so I don't even know how they got it together. They shipped people in from the outside. But now, I mentioned this guy before. This guy, Clement Vallandigham, the leading Copperhead of the time. He was a congressman from Dayton, Ohio, completely sympathetic to the South. And He was so, his statements were so treasonous that he was kicked out of the country. He was kicked out, exiled to the Confederacy. He's kicked out. He travels across the Confederacy, takes a boat up to Canada, goes to Windsor, Canada. Well, in 1863, he campaigns for president or governor. But you'll notice what the Salina newspaper said about him. This is the best and noblest man in America. A lot of Copperhead sentiment here in Mercer County. And as we'll see, it's tied to a particular part of this county. Okay. So there are some big elections. I mean, elections still happen during this, this war. There are elections going on. And there are two big elections in Ohio. There's a governor's race in 1863. Clement Vallandigham running against John Brough, who's the Republican candidate. In 1864, you have even more important election. General George McClellan, the Democratic nominee, running against Abraham Lincoln. Now, take away the suspense. The Republicans won both elections by big votes, but something about the results are kind of interesting. Because even though they won the election, if you look here in Mercer County, Clement Vallandigham got his, of all the 88 counties in Ohio, Mercer County gave Clement Vallandigham his highest percentage of the vote. He got 2/3 of the vote here. There's a lot of Copperhead sentiment in Mercer County. When McClellan ran against Lincoln, McClellan got 75% of the vote here. And again, we get an idea of where this sentiment is strongest. Gibson Township, down around Fort Recovery, 161-2 for McClellan. Marion Township, good old Marion, Maria Stein, 331 for McClellan, 0 for Lincoln. Nada, nothing. I'd like to go down to Marion and walk the halls and see if they have any pictures of Abraham Lincoln up there. Because they sure can't say, well, my great-great-grandfather voted for him. No, he didn't. Who voted for him in Mercer County? Voted for Lincoln. Union Township. Union Township voted 2-1 for Lincoln. If you study Union Township in every election since the 1860s, that township has voted Republican. But the other group that votes more than 2-1 for them are soldiers. Soldiers can vote at that time, and they vote for Lincoln. Blacks can't vote then. No. Yeah, back then political issue, of course, was the war, the financial cost, the cost in lives. But there are other issues associated with the war that cause a lot of controversy. And one of them is whether blacks are going to be allowed to serve in the military. And the opinions of two Mercer County men get changed during this war. One of them is this man right here, Alex Knapp. Alex Knapp was a captain of Company K of the 40th OVI. And his unit is campaigning down in Virginia, not in Virginia, in Kentucky, against Confederate soldiers and against Confederate guerrillas. And he really catches a break because a black slave comes to him with all kinds of secret information that he's providing him. This slave had been the property of a Confederate colonel, Andrew Jackson May. And he's listening to things that they're saying at May's house, and he's bringing that information back to the Union, back to Knapp. And this saves hundreds, of lives, Union lives, because they know where the Confederate troops are moving, they know where ambushes are going to be set up, they know where messages are being carried, and this guy is providing that with information like that, okay? Billy, which is the slave's name, Billy gets sick. He gets typhoid fever. Knapp wants to put him in an Army hospital. The Army says, no, he's not a soldier. We can't put him in a hospital. So he pays to have this guy put into a private home and taken care of there. But the 40th gets moved out. They're being moved along the line. Knapp knows that if he leaves Billy there, he's dead. Confederates will kill him. Knapp tries to send Billy back to Fort Recovery to get better. And the people in Fort Recovery go crazy. They won't let this black guy go into their community. And the Western Standard supports the local community, supports Fort Recovery. They come out with a column that doesn't use Knapp's name, but talk about how bad it is about these officers bringing blacks back into our county. And Knapp reacts. He writes a letter to the Standard. He says, how can you people not want to take care of this guy? You know he saved some of your kids and brothers and uncles and whatever family members' lives. And you won't let him come back here to recover? And the people down there just start tearing Knapp apart, saying he's a liar and a coward, a thief, wrecking his reputation. The members of Knapp's regiment, his other officers, including the commanding officer, write to the paper and say, Knapp is honest, trustworthy, and a very brave soldier who has often led charges. But this, again, affects Knapp's position on black serving. Guy we mentioned earlier in some more detail,